In an $8 billion spending spree in 1997-98, Monsanto bought a number of major seed companies, including Pioneer's biggest rival, DeKalb, as Shapiro schemed to make Monsanto into the Microsoft of seeds. One of his intended purchases, the Delta and Pine Land Company, controlled 70% of the U.S. cottonseed market. Delta and Pine also owned the rights to an interesting biotech innovation invented in a U.S. Department of Agriculture research lab in Lubbock, Texas, a technique for preventing a crop from producing any fertile seeds. The ingenious molecular trick involves flipping a set of genetic switches in the seed before it is sold to the farmer. The crop develops normally, but produces seeds incapable of germinating. Here was the real key to making money in the seed business. Farmers would have to come back every year to the seed company. Though it might seem in principle counterproductive and something of an oxymoron, non-germinating seed is actually of general benefit to agriculture in the long run. If farmers buy seed every year, as they do anyway in the case of hybrid corn, then the improved economics of seed production promote the development of new and better varieties. Ordinary germinating forms would always be available for those who wished them. Farmers would buy the non-germinating kind only if it were superior in yield and other characteristics farmers care about. In short, non-germinating technology, while closing off one option, provides farmers with more and ever-improved seed choices. For Monsanto, however, this technology precipitated a public relations disaster. Activists dubbed it the Terminator gene. They evoked visions of the downtrodden third world farmer accustomed by tradition to relying on his last crop to provide seeds to sow for the new one. Suddenly finding his own seeds useless, he would have no choice but to return to the greedy multinational and, like Oliver Twist, beg pathetically for more. Well, Monsanto backed off. A humiliated Shapiro publicly disavowed the technology, and the Terminator gene remains out of commission to this day. Through the public relations fallout, its only real impact to date has been the termination of Monsanto's grandiose ambitions of the late 1990s. Much of the hostility to GM foods, as we saw in the last chapter with bovine growth hormone, has been orchestrated by professional alarmists like Jeremy Rifkin. His counterpart in the United Kingdom, Lord Peter Melchett, was equally effective until he lost credibility in the environmental movement by quitting Greenpeace to join a public relations firm that has, in the past, worked for Monsanto. Rifkin, the son of a self-made plastic bag manufacturer from Chicago, may differ in style from Melchett, a former Eton boy from a grand family, but they share a vision of corporate America as conspiratorial juggernaut, pitted against the helpless common man. Nor was the reception of GM foods been aided by the knee-jerk politically craven attitudes and even scientific incompetence typical of government regulatory agencies. In this country, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, when they have been confronted with these new technologies. Roger Beachy, who first identified the cross-protection phenomenon that saved Hawaii's papaya farmers from ruin, remembers how the EPA responded to his breakthrough. I naively thought that developing virus-resistant plants in order to reduce the use of insecticides would be viewed as a positive advance. However, the EPA basically said, if you use a gene that protects the plant from a virus, which is a pest, that gene must be considered a pesticide. Thus, the EPA considered the genetically transformed plants to be pesticidal. Now, the point of the story is that as genetic sciences and biotech developed, the federal agencies were taken somewhat by surprise. The agencies did not have the background or expertise to regulate the new varieties of crop plants that were developed. and they did not have the background to regulate the environmental impacts of transgenic crops in agriculture. An even more glaring instance of the government regulators' ineptitude came in the so-called Starlink episode. Starlink, a Bt corn variety produced by the European multinational Aventis, had run afoul of the EPA when its Bt protein was found not to degrade as readily as other Bt proteins in an acidic environment, one like that of the human stomach. In principle, therefore, eating Starlink corn might cause an allergic reaction, although there was never any evidence that it actually would. The EPA dithered. Eventually, it decided to approve Starlink for use in cattle feed, but not for human consumption. And so, under EPA zero-tolerance regulations, the presence of a single molecule of Starlink in a food product constituted illegal contamination. Farmers were growing Starlink and non-Starlink corn side by side, and non-Starlink crops inevitably became contaminated. Even a single Starlink plant that had inadvertently found its way into the harvest from whole fields of non-Starlink was enough. Not surprisingly, Starlink began to show up in food products. The absolute quantities were tiny, but genetic testing to detect the presence of Starlink is supersensitive. In late September 2000, Kraft Foods launched a recall of taco shells deemed to be tainted with Starlink, and a week later, Aventis began a buyback program to recover Starlink seed from the farmers who had bought it. The estimated cost of the cleanup program, $100 million. Blame for this debacle can only be laid at the door of an overzealous and irrational EPA.
This book is continued